Welcome to AI TV, everybody, and we're broadcasting live from AI Expo Africa 2020 online. This is day 2 of our virtual conference. We've gone online this year because of COVID, but it gives me great pleasure to welcome a big supporter of our event, UiPath, who've been a sponsor this year, and their chief evangelist, Guy Kirkwood, who gave a talk at the show. Welcome, Guy. Welcome to AI TV. How are you doing?
Thank you very much, Nick. Yeah, I mean, it seems strange that, at the time of COVID, that essentially what we're seeing is that presentations are taking place all over the world. I did one at 4:30 my local time the other morning in Singapore, and then tacked up my horse and went riding. It was fantastic, as opposed to traveling. But it's a shame that I wasn't able to make it to South Africa. It's a fantastic country. So,
yeah.
But it was really nice to get involved in the show.
No, that's great. Look, I mean, the show happens at the beginning of springtime, so it normally is the advent of warmer weather. So it would have been a good time to come. But yeah, look, we have a real-time map of who's logging on at the show, and it's like east and west. I mean, Singapore to San Francisco, and a lot of people from Europe this year, which is great. I mean, the great thing about the online event platform is that you've got instant globalization in terms of people being able to log on. And yeah, we've certainly seen that. I think we've had 25 countries attend the show this year, and I think that really, unless you're doing like a mega event that's been around for a long time, an event like ours, to have that kind of eyeballs is really good. But bringing it back to the core of this conversation, I mean, UiPath really revolutionizing the whole RPA landscape, and we've had a lot of feedback about UiPath's presence at the show. But guys, as a chief evangelist, I mean, you've got your finger on the pulse with RPA and what's happening now. I've got the fusing of AI into that discipline. Where's it all heading? I mean, I think the tagline from your founder is one robot per person. I mean, it's quite an interesting, ambitious.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? If you go back, we were talking about your time when you used to live in Salisbury before we started recording here. If you think back in time, to the late 70s, for instance, Bill Gates said that he envisaged a time when every household and every desk would have a computer, and he got laughed at.
Yep.
We now think that it's possible that every, certainly worker initially, will have their own robot. So let's talk about what a robot is. So up until about a couple of years ago, not many people knew what RPA was, robotic process automation. And so we had, questions like, how do you stop the robot pressing the screen too hard, and those sort of questions. Yeah. So put that to bed. These robots are software robots. So the term robotic process automation was actually invented by Blue Prism, who really created the RPA market. And we stand on the shoulder of giants. I mean, Blue Prism have done a phenomenal job of creating the category that is RPA. So in the last 4 years, UiPath has done quite well. We've grown incredibly quickly, and we've even been described as the fastest growing enterprise software business ever. And the reason for that is that more and more organizations are seeing automating the boring, mundane, repetitive work that people have to do their job as being unnecessarily complex. I mentioned this in the presentation yesterday. A friend of mine called Ian Barkin, who's described the way that processes build up in organizations like sedimentary rock. This process sediment builds up over millions of years for geological time, but in businesses it builds up over decades. And so cutting through that is something that's really important to the efficiency and cost effectiveness of organizations. And if you add in the impact of COVID, when organizations went from saying none of our people are going to work from home ever to everyone's working from home in the next 2 weeks, what we really got is a fundamental change. So Microsoft, who've recently moved into the RPA market, for instance, they've said that they did more in the last 2 months than they had done in the last 2 years. So the acceleration of what's happening within business and the forcing of organizations to do more digital transformation is really what's rising RPA to the top. Then if you combine the AI tools, the artificial intelligence tools, what you're actually able to do is automate more of those tasks in a more intelligent way. because RPA is really good at dealing with the structured information, the rules-based activities. And it tends to start in finance for that reason. You know, the entire world is run on Excel. So it tends to start in finance and then spreads out throughout the organization. The use of AI and what we term as understandings. So, you know, the system has to understand everything on the screen in the same way that you or I do as a human. It has to understand documents, you know, because we're still waiting around in paper. It has to understand processes. So, you know, to understand what is automatable and how to do that. And then it has to understand voice and language. So, you know, the language understanding required for at the moment for chatbots, but ultimately, you know, these things are going to be controlled by voice. So all of that comes together in these platforms, and it's what Gartner have described as hyper automation.
Okay.
So it's not just RPA, but it's all of these tools necessary as well. And we think ultimately everyone will have their own robot, partly unattended to do stuff, frankly, you never want to see again. It's that boring, mundane, what I call crappy job, bits of your job that you don't want to do. And partly to help you to do the stuff that you do want to do, to help you to do the things that are required. And so it's a combination of both of those things. But ultimately, I think that RPA and AI are going to disappear. And they're not going to disappear because they're not going to get used. I think they're going to disappear because they're going to get used everywhere. It will just become part of the fabric of work and then ultimately part of the fabric of living. In the same way that, you know, we now carry around, you know, computers in our pockets. And sometimes on our wrists.
I mean, I discovered, I mean, this is not really RPA, but I mean, I discovered this app called Calendly. And I used it to set up all the talks for these interviews. Now, I worked out that if I spend going backwards and forwards with email, trying to find someone to put a slot in my diary to do one of these interviews, it actually uses a lot of my time. So actually, I set it all up, chose the time I wanted, and then I put the onus back on other people, obviously, to do that. But my diary filled up with 33 interviews in about half an hour. Now, I mean, that's a kind of fairly simplistic way of automating a process. But at what scale are you guys doing? I mean, because you're at the industrial end of it. I mean, what is the scale that you guys are doing this on?
Let's take PwC, for instance. You know, most people know PricewaterhouseCoopers as one of the big audit-based and system integration and consulting organizations. They did a trial last year in the US where they gave every one of their employees a robot, a UiPath license to automate the bits of the job they hated, basically. And it actually gave them 30% of their time back. And that's actually how you measure things. You don't measure things in you know, up to about 3 years ago, I suppose every business case for RPA was predicated on job cuts, on cost out, on headcount reduction. But actually what organizations have found is that the value of once they put automation in, the value of their human capital is actually much better, much higher than they thought it was. So I'll give you a classic quote. There's the chief executive of one of our companies, one of our customers, early customer actually, is an insurance business. And he said, since we put in automation, the mood music of our business has changed. We have happier employees and we now measure our service in terms of compliments rather than complaints. That, Nick, has nothing to do with technology. That is all about culture change. And this is what PwC found as well. So it added time back and improved the employee engagement of the people in their organization. And they were so happy that they're now rolling that out throughout their entire estate. So that's 286,000 people around the world. So that's one of the very first organizations that really did this robot for every person stuff. And I think that's accelerating as more and more organizations. So for instance, last year we had 5 companies spending more than $1 million with us every year. That's now over 60, and we've got another 70 in the pipeline. And that's been driven actually a lot by COVID, which is why we're doing all these virtual events.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, you know, it takes a catastrophe sometimes to shake out the inefficiency in a system. I mean, really, I've come a systems software background myself and working with enterprise change programs, really around building complex systems. And really the world is just one massive complex system. And COVID's found some massive weaknesses in the fragility of some aspects of our society, and accelerated, I think, this journey to really the ultimate conclusion. We are going to embrace it, and now we have to embrace it. It's not optional anymore. And it's not even really necessarily a competitive thing. It's, as you say, it's a liberation of capital. It's giving people more time to do maybe more value add activities in the business and in society, potentially to add some better quality of time into your own life. I mean, when it comes to the consumer or people like you and me having a robot, what do you think the first things that would be taken care of for, just say, a consumer? What sort of things do you think or on the pipeline?
We're not. I mean, UiPath is not going to come out with a consumer version of our robot, at least not for the foreseeable future. But I think that people will, in the same way that they take their laptops home and so on, I think that the people will automate their day-to-day living. So you mentioned Calendly. It will be interfaces into things like that, so that you're managing, when the children do ballet classes or scouts or whatever it is that they do, and when you've got dental appointments and all the rest of it, all of that will start to get automated.
Yeah.
In fact, it does raise an interesting ethical question, because ultimately, if everyone's got their own robot, when you go to a new job, do you own the robot, or does the company own the robot? So we're now talking about bring your own device. Perhaps ultimately we're going to be moving towards bring your own robot. So and your robot learns, or your person, they're not going to be called robots, but your personal assistant will learn the job in the same way that you do, in the same time that you do. Because ultimately we're moving towards a time when the robots will build themselves. We're not there yet, but we're going towards that using process mining and task mining and so on, because you need to identify the optimum route through any process. And at the moment, what for the technically minded, what you're building is a process description document or a XAML script that it creates the framework, the sort of scaffolding, if you like, to actually build the robot. But ultimately, it will build itself. So let's say you go to a new company and you've got a whole load of new systems to learn. As soon as you start going through that, the robot will just watch what the human does and say, okay, I can automate this for you now. Yeah. So, that's quite an interesting dynamic, and it will radically change the world of work. Everyone talks about the future of work and digital transformation. This, I think, will have a fundamental impact. So I think it's really important that it's our responsibility as vendors, and as what the Forrester described as the digital elites, the people like you and I, to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind. And that's a really important point, because I think that the world of work is going to change. So at the moment, the ratio between full-time employment and gig economy is about 70-30. So 70% full-time employment, 30% gig. I think that that's going to reverse over the next 10 to 20 years. So what that means is that it's up to us as the vendors and the consulting companies and all the rest of it to make sure that their people are looked after, so that they don't have to go and find their next gig. That is supplied by us. So let's say you need 2 people in Egypt, and 3 people in Iceland, and 4 people in Kazakhstan. We're building the platform necessary that those people will be identified and their experience shown to the world. So think of it like a mixture between sort of Facebook and LinkedIn. Not a social network as such, but really just a repository of experience. And that could be experience in UiPath, it could be experience in Automation Anywhere, in Blue Prism, in Kofax, or any of the other RPA vendors. So interesting stuff.
And what about, I mean, just to sort of wrap it up, Guy, I mean, clearly things like voice-based assistants now that people are finding in their homes, or Google and Amazon, the voice device that's in your room and you're asking it to do. I mean, where do you see this crossover between speaking into a device and RPA colliding? Where do you see that?
It already works. you can already trigger a robot using voice, but the issue for organizations, for companies, is that we all use a language that is specific to that process or that industry. And the best example that I use for this is, if you're sitting in a bank and the robot doesn't understand something, we'll flag it up to the human user, and the human user says voice, "Oh, okay, robot, stick that in the Wells account." Now the system has to understand that Wells in this case means Wells Fargo. It does not mean a hole in the ground with water at the bottom, or a town in Somerset in the UK, because they're all Wells. And so everyone will have had frustrations of Siri or Cortana or Alexa not understanding what you're talking about. So getting those ontology, what's known as ontologies,
That's right, exactly.
the correct ontologies necessary for natural language understanding in order for that to work. And there's still work to do.
Yeah, yeah. So, look, Guy, I mean, we could have this conversation probably for the rest of the afternoon, but it's a real pleasure to finally see the face behind the Twitter channel that sends me such useful information. I definitely recommend anyone who's watching this to follow Guy on Twitter. There's not a day goes by where there's an infographic or something that you send out, which I find very useful. And it's been a real pleasure.
I steal mainly.
Well, it's still useful. I find it very useful, no matter where it comes from. But Guy, it's been a real pleasure having you on AI TV at AI Expo Africa 2020 online. And also a big thank you to Lenore and the team here at UiPath in South Africa, who put up a great virtual booth in our expo hall, and the talks obviously that have also been given. So, just to wrap up, thanks very much for your time and sharing your insights on what is a really fascinating kind of decade of change we've got ahead of us. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick.